On the afternoon of February 21st, 1945, on a black volcanic island 750 miles south of Tokyo, the Japanese gunner watched a Sherman tank roll to a stop at 125 yards. He had seen Shermans before. He had killed Shermans before. He raised his rifle and waited for the cannon to fire. The cannon did not fire. What came out of that barrel was something no Japanese soldier on Iwo Jima had ever seen, and almost none of them would live long enough to describe it. 150 miles north of that island, in a small concrete radio room, half buried into the slope of a place called Chichijima, a 31-year-old staff officer named Major Yoshitaka Hori did not yet know what had just happened. He was about to spend 3 days finding out. The radio room at Chichijima sat 150 miles north of Hell. It was a small concrete structure, half buried against the slope, its antenna trembling in the Pacific wind. Inside, beneath a single bare bulb, a 31-year-old staff officer named Major Yoshitaka Hori pressed a headset to one ear and waited. He had been waiting for 3 days. The last message had come on the evening of March 23rd, 1945. He still remembered the exact words because they were the last words Uz would ever hear from the man he had served. The voice was calm. The voice was tired. The voice belonged to Lieutenant General Tadamichi Kuribayashi, commander of the Ogasawara Army Group, and it said only this: all officers and men of Chichijima, goodbye from Iwo. Then static. For 3 days, Hori kept calling. He turned the dial. He repeated the frequencies. He sat through the long Pacific nights, listening to the hiss of empty air, hoping that somewhere beneath that volcanic island, in a tunnel 75 feet below the sulfur and the ash, a man he respected more than any other was still alive. But the silence held, and the silence meant something terrible had happened on Iwo Jima, something that no one on the Japanese side, not even Kuribayashi himself, had quite imagined when this whole nightmare began. What no one knew yet, what not be fully understood for decades, was that the most brilliant Japanese defensive plan of the entire Pacific War had been undone not by battleships, not by carriers, not by the atomic energy that was even then being assembled in the desert of New Mexico, but by 8 modified tanks designed in secret by 2 enlisted mechanics in Hawaii whose names would never appear in any newspaper. This is the story of how that happened. This is the story of the men inside those tanks, and the men they burned, and the man who built a fortress out of a volcano and watched it become a tomb. To understand Iwo Jima, you have to understand why anyone wanted it. By the summer of 1944, the war in the Pacific had entered its final terrible phase. American forces had taken Saipan Tinian, had fallen. The Marianas were in American hands, and from those islands the new B-29 Superfortress bombers, silver, enormous, the most expensive weapons program in human history until the atomic bomb surpassed them, could finally reach the Japanese home islands. But the bombers had a problem. The flight from Saipan to Tokyo was 1,500 miles each way, 3,000 miles round trip. Engines failed, fuel ran low, damaged aircraft riddled with flak could not always limp home. They ditched in the empty ocean. Their crews drowned. And in the middle of that long, dangerous flight path sat a small pork-chop-shaped island of black volcanic sand. 8 square miles in total, with 3 airfields the Japanese were using to send up fighters that intercepted the bombers and to launch nuisance raids back against the American bases. The island was called Iwo Jima, Sulphur Island. Whoever held it controlled the air corridor to Japan. So in October of 1944, American planners settled on Operation Detachment, the invasion of Iwo Jima. The intelligence estimates were confident. The island was small. The garrison was modest. Naval and aerial bombardment would soften it for weeks. The Marines would land, sweep across the volcanic ash, and the whole thing would be over in 5 days. 5 days. That was the number the planners gave General Holland M. Smith, the 62-year-old commander of the 5th Amphibious Corps, a Marine officer so famously short-tempered that his own men called him howlin' mad. 5 days and Iwo Jima would be American. They were not just wrong. They were catastrophically, historically wrong, and the reason was a man they did not yet know existed. a 53-year-old Japanese general who had been sent to the island the previous June with a single impossible order from Emperor Hirohito himself: stop the Americans at any cost. Tadamichi Kuribayashi was born on July 7, 1891, in the cold mountain district of Nagano, the descendant of 6 generations of samurai. As a teenager, he had wanted to be a journalist. His teachers steered him toward the army instead. He was a quiet man with a long, melancholy face, fond of poetry, fluent in English, and devoted to his wife Yoshi and their 3 children, to whom he wrote letters constantly throughout his life. But what made Kuribayashi different from almost every other Japanese general was this: he had lived in America. From 1928 to 1930, as a young captain, Kuribayashi had been posted to the United States as a military attaché. He lodged with a family in Buffalo, New York. He studied at Harvard. He attended the University of Mission. He bought a car and drove it across the country, alone, watching the wheat fields of Kansas slide past his window. He visited the great factories of Detroit. He saw the assembly lines, and he understood, with a clarity that almost no other Japanese officer of his generation possessed, exactly what would happen if Japan went to war with this country. He wrote home once, "By the push of one button, all the industries will be mobilized for military business." He knew what was coming. And on June 8, 1944, when Prime Minister Hideki Tojo handed him the orders to defend Iwo Jima, Kuribayashi was given a private audience with the emperor, a rare honor, and told that the Americans must be stopped at all costs. He flew to the island. He looked at the black sand. He looked at the volcano rising at the southern tip, Mount Suribachi, 550 feet of ancient lava cone. He looked at the empty ridges to the north, and he made a decision that broke with centuries of samurai tradition. There would be no glorious charges at the water's edge. There would be no banzai attacks at dawn. There would be no warriors meeting their enemies face to face in honorable battle. His 21,000 men would fight from underground. The first twist of this story is hidden inside that decision. The general most fanatically committed to stopping America was the Japanese officer who understood America best. He had seen what America could do when it decided to build something, and it was precisely because he respected American firepower that he refused to meet it on the beach. His own staff fought him. Vice Admiral Sadaichi Matsunaga, who had wanted to build the old-style coastal defenses, was eventually relieved of command when he refused to accept Kuribayashi's underground strategy. The dispute was kicked all the way up to Tokyo, where the Germans were consulted, and the German general staff sided with Kuribayashi. So the work began. 11 miles of interconnected tunnels were dug into the porous volcanic rock, with another 6 miles planned. The command bunker, the Nanpo bunker, was driven 75 feet underground. 750 major defensive installations were carved out of the island. Pillboxes with concrete walls 4 feet thick, gun emplacements with steel doors that opened only to fire and then sealed shut again, underground hospitals, ammunition dumps, water cisterns, ventilation shafts, disguised as natural rock. Kuribayashi positioned his weapons with mathematical care. Every square meter of the island was registered on someone's gun. Every approach was an interlocking field of fire. He wrote out 6 rules for his men. He called them the courageous battle vows. Each man was to kill 10 Americans before he died. No man was to surrender. No man was to launch a banzai charge. Kuribayashi considered them a senseless waste of life. Each defender was to fight from his hole until he was overrun, and then he was to fight with grenades, and then with his bayonet, and then with his hands. His armor commander was a baron, Colonel Takichi Nishi, 42 years old, who had won a gold medal in show jumping at the 1932 Los Angeles Olympics, befriended Mary Pickford and Douglas Fairbanks during his time in California, and was perhaps the most internationally famous Japanese soldier on the island. The 2 men understood each other. They had both lived in America. They both knew what was coming. And what was coming in the autumn of 1944 was the longest sustained bombardment in the history of the Pacific Theater. Starting on June 15, 1944, American naval and air forces began pounding Iwo Jima. For 74 straight days before the landings, B-24 Liberators dropped 6,800 tons of bombs on the island. Naval bombardment hurled 22,000 shells onto Japanese positions, 16-inch shells from battleships, 8-inch shells from cruisers, smaller rounds from the destroyers that crept in close to the shore. American photographic reconnaissance showed Iwo Jima as a landscape of overlapping craters, a smoking ruin. The planners looked at those photographs and smiled. Nothing could survive that, they said. The garrison must be shattered. The bunkers must be pulverized. When the Marines hit the beach, they would walk into a wasteland of stunned, half-dead defenders. 5 days. The island would fall in 5 days. Here is the second twist. Of the 750 major fortifications Kuribayashi had built, fewer than 200 had been destroyed by the longest and most intensive preliminary bombardment of the Pacific War. Less than 200 out of 750. The tunnel system was virtually intact. The command bunker, 75 feet underground, had not been touched. The pre-registered artillery, hidden behind those steel doors, was untouched. Most of the 21,000 defenders had not been scratched. The bombs and shells had cratered the surface. They had killed almost no one. The battle was already lost before it began. The Americans simply did not know it yet. On the morning of February 19, 1945, the largest amphibious assault force in the Pacific War to date, about 450 ships, 60,000 Marines, gathered off the southern beaches of Iwo Jima. At 9 a.m., the first wave hit the sand, and they discovered the first surprise. The beach was not sand. It was loose volcanic ash, the consistency of coarse gravel, and it swallowed boots up to the calf with every step. Vehicles bogged down immediately. Tanks could not climb the terraces. Men labored forward, bent double, dragging their gear, trying to find cover that did not exist because the entire beach was a single open killing zone, with no foliage, no rocks, no folds in the ground. For 20 minutes, nothing happened. The Marines kept coming. The beach grew crowded. Equipment piled up. Officers shouted at the men to spread out, to move inland, to get off the open sand. Kuribayashi let the congestion build. He was watching from his command bunker. He had given his gunners precise instructions. Hold fire. Let them land. Let them stack up. Let think the bombardment has worked. And then, at the exact moment the beach was most crowded, when the Marines had nowhere to go and nowhere to hide, he opened up everything at once. The volcanic ridges to the north erupted in coordinated fire. Pre-registered artillery, every coordinate already calculated, dropped shells onto the landing zones. Machine gun positions wired into the tunnel network swept the beach in interlocking arcs. Mortars walked their rounds across packed Marines in lines as straight as plowed fields. It was a slaughter. By nightfall on the first day, 2,420 Americans were dead or wounded. Aboard the command ship USS El Dorado, Lieutenant General Holland Smith read the reports as they came in. He stared at the casualty figures. He stared at the maps. He noticed something that did not fit any pattern he had seen in 3 years of Pacific combat. There had been no banzai charge. In every previous battle, Tarawa, Saipan, Tinian, Peleliu, the Japanese had thrown themselves at the Americans in mass suicide attacks that the Marines, terrible as they were, had learned to absorb and grind down. The banzai charge was a Japanese signature. It was the climax of the Japanese defensive playbook, and on Iwo Jima, on D-Day, with thousands of Marines pinned helpless on an open beach, there had been no banzai charge. The Japanese had simply held position and killed Americans by the hundreds, and gone back underground. Holland Smith stared at the reports. He gathered the war correspondents around him in the wardroom of the El Dorado, and he said the words that would later be quoted in every history of the battle. "I don't know who he is, but the Japanese general running this show is one smart bastard." He did not yet know the name Kuribayashi. He would learn it. By the end of D+1, the Marines had advanced less than 700 yards from the waterline. The first airfield, which was supposed to have fallen on D-Day, was still in Japanese hands. The casualty figures were climbing past anything anyone had projected. And the worst part, the part that would become unbearable in the days to come, was that the Marines could not see who was killing them. The Japanese were not on the surface. They were inside the surface. They fired through narrow steel slits and then sealed those slits shut while the American counterfire spent itself harmlessly on 4 feet of concrete. They moved between positions through tunnels the Americans did not know existed. They reappeared behind units that thought they had cleared a sector. The naval bombardment had not killed them. The aerial bombing had not killed them. The artillery preparation had not killed them. Now the riflemen and machine gunners and standard Sherman tanks of the assaulting divisions could not kill them either because there was no way to reach them. The flame from a portable backpack flamethrower would not arc through a 4-inch steel slit. A grenade would not penetrate 4 feet of reinforced concrete. A 75mm tank shell would ricochet off the rounded shoulders of a properly designed pillbox. The American invasion force, the most powerful amphibious army ever assembled in the Pacific, had run headfirst into a fortress designed by a man who had read American engineering journals at Harvard and watched the Detroit assembly lines turn. And on D+1, as the Marines began the long bloody crawl inland through ash that swallowed their feet, 8 Sherman tanks sat unused near the beach. Their crews had been told to stay in reserve. The senior commanders wanted to see what the fight looked like before they committed these particular vehicles. They did not look like much. Olive drab paint, standard hull, standard turret, a 75mm gun barrel pointing forward like any other Sherman in the world. Except that inside the barrels of these 8 tanks there was no shell, there was a nozzle. And behind the nozzle, in modified fuel tanks holding 290 gallons of napalm-thickened diesel, pressurized to 300 pounds per square inch by compressed nitrogen, was something that no Japanese soldier on Iwo Jima had ever encountered before. Something that General Kuribayashi, for all his brilliance, for all his time in America, for all his careful study of every weapon system the United States possessed, had not anticipated and had no defense against. In 2 days, they would begin to fire, and the underground fortress that had been Japan's greatest strength would begin very slowly, very horribly, to become its tomb. But to understand how that happened, we have to leave Iwo Jima for a moment. We have to go back 9 months and 2,000 miles east to a hot, dusty parade ground at Schofield Barracks in Hawaii, where a 60-year-old Army colonel with 44 years of military service was about to be handed an impossible problem, and 2 enlisted mechanics whose names history would almost entirely forget were about to solve it. Schofield Barracks, territory of Hawaii, May 1944. The trade winds came down off the Waianae Range every afternoon, dry and warm, carrying the smell of red dust and motor oil across a complex of low buildings that had stood there since before the First World War. This was where the Pacific War was supplied. This was where the trucks were repaired, and the rifles were zeroed, and the men were trained before they shipped out to die on islands most of them had never heard of. And in one corner of that complex, behind a chain-link fence with a guard at the gate, was a workshop that did not appear on any official organizational chart of the United States Army. The man who ran it was Colonel George F. Unmacht. He was 60 years old. He had enlisted in the Iowa National Guard at 16, and he had been in uniform ever since. 44 years of service. He had been the chemical officer for the entire Pacific Ocean Areas Command since the beginning of the war, reporting through Admiral Chester Nimitz's staff. He had a long, weathered face and the patient eyes of a man who had spent 4 decades watching the Army hand him problems that other people considered unsolvable. And in the spring of 1944, the Army had just handed him another one. The problem was this. The Marines were dying on islands they could not take. At Tarawa, at Saipan, at Peleliu, the Japanese had begun fighting from caves and bunkers and fortified positions that conventional weapons simply could not reduce. Artillery passed over them. Aerial bombs cracked the concrete and killed no one inside. The portable backpack flamethrower, the M2, had a range of 40 yards on a good day, and the man who carried it had to walk those 40 yards in full view of every Japanese rifle on the island. The casualty rate among portable flamethrower operators in Pacific combat was running between 70 and 92%. The Army needed a weapon that could deliver fire from inside armor, from inside a tank, and the Army, in its wisdom, had given that problem to Colonel Unmacht. His resources were modest. He had the 43rd Chemical Laboratory Company. He had a few experimental Navy Mark I flamethrowers that the Navy had brought to Hawaii in April of 1944 and then declared, in writing, unsuitable. They were too heavy, the Navy said, and turned them over to the Army to do with what they wished. It was not much to work with, but Unmacht had spent 44 years in uniform, and he had learned a particular trick about military bureaucracy. When the official channels did not give you what you needed, you went and found the men who could actually fix things, and you put them in a room together and you let them work. So he reached out to the United States Naval Construction Force, the Seabees. The Seabees were already legends in the Pacific. Their motto was Construimus Betuimus, we build, we fight, but the men in the field had simplified it to 2 words, can do. They built airfields under shell fire. They threw up bridges in 24 hours that civilian contractors would have estimated in months. They were older than most other servicemen. The average age in some battalions was over 30, because they were recruited from the trades. They had been carpenters and welders and machinists and electricians before the war, and they brought 30 years of practical workshop knowledge to problems that the regular military had never seen before. Unmacht requested an officer and 25 enlisted Seabees from the 117th Naval Construction Battalion. CINPAC, the Commander-in-Chief Pacific, approved the request personally. The 25 men walked through the gate at Schofield in May of 1944. They looked at what the Army had built. They were polite about it. Then they sat down with the colonel and told him, with the particular tact of men who knew metal, that what the Army had created was over-engineered. There were too many moving parts. There were over 100 separate components in places where 6 would have done the job. They could simplify it. Unmacht let them work. The first prototypes went onto light tanks, M3 Stuarts, and they were christened with the kind of names men give to weapons when they need to laugh at what those weapons do. Hell's afire, Confused Buster. The Seabees called them Satans. They had a fuel capacity of 170 gallons and a range of 60 to 80 yards with thickened fuel, and they were deployed to Saipan in June of 1944, where they performed well enough to convince the Marine Corps that the concept was worth pursuing. But Saipan also revealed the limits. The Satans were light tanks. Their armor was thin, their turrets could only traverse 180 degrees because the fuel lines fouled a full rotation. Japanese 47mm anti-tank guns could kill them at close range. And the fuel capacity was too small, 60 seconds of continuous fire, and you had to back out and refuel. The Marines wanted something bigger, something on a medium tank, something on a Sherman. In September of 1944, the Army formally established Colonel Unmacht's project as the Chemical Warfare Service Flamethrower Group. 56 more Seabees were requested. Personnel from the 81st Ordnance Company joined. Men from the 5th Marine Tank Battalion came in to advise. And Unmacht's small workshop at Schofield Barracks went looking for 8 M4A3 Sherman tanks that nobody else was using. They found them. They were given them. And in the autumn of 1944, the real work began. The men who designed the weapon that would change the Pacific War were not generals. They were 2 enlisted Seabees. Machinist's mate First Class A.A. Reiche was the metal man. He understood pressure systems. He understood how fluids flowed through pipes under load. He understood how a nozzle needed to be machined to produce a clean, accurate stream of burning fuel at 120 meters. Electrician's mate Second Class Joseph Kissel was the wire man. He understood ignition circuits. He understood how to make 1,000 electrical connections inside a tank turret without any of them failing under combat shock. between them in the heat of the Hawaiian autumn, sleeping in shifts beside their welding equipment, working 20-hour days. Reiche and Kissel took the best ideas from 3 separate flamethrower systems, the Canadian Ronson, the Navy Model I, and the Navy Mark I, and combined them into something none of those systems had been alone. They called it the CBH-1, Construction Battalion, Hawaii, version 1. The specifications were extraordinary. The pressure was 300 pounds per square inch, triple what previous tank-mounted flamethrowers had managed. The range was 400 feet, 120 meters, 3 times the range of the portable M2 backpack unit that men like Hershel Williams were carrying on foot into Japanese fire. The fuel was a carefully calibrated mixture of diesel, gasoline, and napalm thickener developed by the 43rd Chemical Laboratory, 290 gallons of it, sloshing in modified tanks inside the Sherman hull. The propellant was compressed nitrogen, chosen over compressed air because nitrogen could not support combustion if the tank was hit and the propellant tank was breached. And the genius of it, the part that would matter most when these 8 machines went into combat, was that the flamethrower replaced the main 75mm gun. This meant the turret could traverse the full 270 degrees. It meant the weapon could elevate and depress through the tank's existing fire control system. It meant the gunner could aim a stream of burning napalm the same way he aimed a cannon shell, through the same periscope, with the same controls, with the same precision. And from outside, looking at the tank, you could not tell. The vehicle was painted standard Marine Corps olive drab. The nozzle was hidden inside the barrel jacket. The fuel tanks were inside the hull. To a Japanese observer watching a Sherman crest a rise on Iwo Jima, the 8 Seabees CH-1 tanks looked exactly like any of the dozens of other Shermans on the island. Until the moment they fired. By then it was too late. Each conversion took 1,200 man-hours of labor. Each tank required 1,100 electrical connections to be changed or relocated. 150 pounds of welding rod. 150 parts that the Seabees machined themselves, because no parts depot in the Pacific stocked them. The cost ran between $20,000 and $25,000 per tank, close to $360,000 in today's money. The official Marine Corps designation was M4A3R5. The Army called it POA CWSH-1. The Seabees and the Marines who used them simply called them the Mark I. The Japanese, when they saw them, called them M1 tanks. The historians believe this was a mistranslation. Either way, it did not matter what name they gave them, because none of the names changed what those tanks were about to do. Here is the third twist of this story. The weapon that broke the back of the most sophisticated defensive system in the Pacific theater was not designed by generals. It was not designed by senior engineers. It was not the product of a major defense contractor or a famous laboratory. It was designed by 2 enlisted mechanics in a workshop behind a chain-link fence at Schofield Barracks. Their names were Reiche and Kissel. They worked 20-hour days. They received no public recognition. Reiche's name appears almost nowhere outside one 1948 article in the Naval Institute proceedings. Kissel's name appears once in the same article, and then nothing. But in February of 1945, 8 Sherman tanks built around their design were loaded onto landing ships bound for an island that did not exist on most American maps before the war. 4 of those tanks were assigned to the 4th Marine Tank Battalion. 4 were assigned to the 5th. And on D-Day, February 19, 1945, all 8 of them came ashore with the rest of the assault force, mixed in among the conventional Shermans, indistinguishable from the outside, sitting on the killing beach in the volcanic ash, waiting for the order to move. The order did not come for 2 days. For 2 days, the Marines died in the open. Men of the 4th and 5th Divisions crawled forward across that ash and into pre-registered artillery fire and machine gun lanes that nobody could see and nobody could suppress. Conventional Sherman tanks tried to roll inland and bog down or were destroyed by hidden anti-tank guns. By the night of February 20th, the Marines had advanced less than 700 yards from the waterline and had lost killed and wounded numbering in the thousands. The flame tanks sat in reserve, hidden under tarps near the beach. The senior officers wanted to assess the tactical situation before they committed something they knew they could not replace. On the morning of February 21st, D2, the situation collapsed. The 21st Marine Regiment was pinned down at the edge of Motoyama Airfield No. 1. 3 concrete pillboxes covered the approaches with interlocking machine gun fire. 2 rifle companies had already been wrecked trying to take them. The regiment had lost over 1/3 of its strength in less than 48 hours. The battalion commander made the call: bring up the flame tanks. The first CBH-1 to fire on Iwo Jima rolled forward under its own power through the ash, looking like any other Sherman, and approached the lead pillbox from an angle that exploited a piece of cover provided by a destroyed Japanese aircraft. The Japanese gunners inside watched it come. They had seen Shermans before. They had killed Shermans before. They held fire and waited for the standard cannon shot. At 125 yards, the tank stopped. There was a pause. Then a sound that the Japanese gunners had never heard before, a long mechanical hiss of compressed nitrogen, and the air between the tank and the pillbox turned into a wall of liquid fire. The napalm went through the slit. What happened inside that pillbox happened in seconds. The temperature climbed past 1200 degrees Fahrenheit. The oxygen was consumed faster than the men inside could see. Anyone who survived the first second of the blast tried to flee through the rear exit and was cut down by Marine riflemen who had learned in less than an hour where to position themselves for exactly this eventuality. The second pillbox tried to fire back. A Japanese 47mm anti-tank gun put a shell into the Sherman's frontal armor. The shell ricocheted skyward. The tank shuddered. It continued forward. Another burst of flame. Another pillbox dark inside the smoke. The third pillbox was harder. It sat behind a rocky outcropping that prevented a direct shot. The flame tank had to advance to within 80 yards, dangerously close to Japanese infantry positions. And it was at that moment that something happened which proved the CB design. Japanese soldiers emerged from spider holes behind the tank, rushing forward with satchel charges and magnetic mines. A standard Satan would have died there. The Satan's turret could only traverse 180 degrees. The flame tank's blind spot was its rear, but the CBH-1 turret could rotate 270 degrees. The gunner swung it. A wall of burning napalm consumed the attackers from behind. By nightfall on February 20th, in less than 6 hours of combat, 8 tanks had destroyed dozens of Japanese fortified positions. In the sectors where they operated, the killing dropped sharply, almost overnight. The Marines had gained 600 yards in places that had been frozen for 2 days. The word went back through the command net. The flame tanks worked. 3 days later, on February 23, 1945, 2 things happened on Iwo Jima that should be remembered together, because they explain something important about what kind of battle this was. The first thing was that a small patrol of Marines from Easy Company, 2nd Battalion, 28th Marines reached the summit of Mount Suribachi. They raised a small American flag. A few hours later, a second patrol replaced it with a larger one. An Associated Press photographer named Joe Rosenthal happened to be standing at the right angle at the right second, and he pressed his shutter, and the photograph he took became one of the most reproduced images in the history of human civilization. Back in the United States, people wept in the streets. War bond drives were organized around the photograph. Newspaper editors put it on the front page. The country celebrated. Iwo Jima had been won. The flag was flying. The Marines had done it again. Here is the fourth twist. When that flag went up on Mount Suribachi, 4/5 of the battle still lay ahead. Most of the casualties had not yet happened. Most of the Marines who would die on that island were still alive on February 23rd. The northern plateau, where Kuribayashi had concentrated 15,000 men in interlocking defensive lines, had not been touched. The meat grinder, where 850 Marines would die taking a single hill, had not been fought yet. The bloody Gorge, where the final stand would happen, was a month away. The photograph that became the symbol of American victory in the Pacific was taken on the 5th day of a 36-day battle in which the worst killing had not yet begun. The second thing that happened on February 23rd was that a 21-year-old corporal from a dairy farm in Quiet Dell, West Virginia, walked into a kill zone with 70 pounds of fire on his back. His name was Hershel Woodrow Williams. He went by Woody. He was 5 feet 6 inches tall. The Marine Corps had rejected him the first time he tried to enlist in 1942 because he was too short. They changed the height requirement in May of 1943, and he tried again, and this time they took him. He was the youngest of 11 children. 6 of his siblings had died in the influenza pandemic of 1918 before he was born. He had grown up driving a taxi and a truck for a construction company. He had a wife back home named Ruby, though they would not marry until October of that year. On February 21st, 1945, Corporal Williams landed on Iwo Jima with the 1st Battalion, 21st Marine Regiment, 3rd Marine Division. 2 days later, his company was pinned down at the same airfield the flame tanks had attacked. But the flame tanks could not get into this particular stretch of ground. The terrain was too tight. A series of reinforced concrete pillboxes was raking the Marines with machine gun fire that nothing seemed to silence. His captain looked at him. There was no order, just a question. Williams answered it with 2 words. "I'll try." He strapped on an M2 backpack flamethrower, 2 cylinders, 70 pounds, half his body weight, and 4 riflemen agreed to cover him. He crawled forward into the open. He could hear the rounds ricocheting off the air tank on his back. He has said, in interviews recorded decades later, that he did not understand at the time why he was not afraid. He has said he could not really explain it afterward either. For the next 4 hours, Corporal Hershel Williams crawled from pillbox to pillbox under direct machine gun fire. He returned to his own lines 5 separate times to swap out empty flamethrowers and prepare new demolition charges. Once, he climbed on top of a pillbox and shoved the nozzle through the air vent. When it was over, he had destroyed 7 concrete pillboxes by himself. 2 of the 4 riflemen covering him were dead. The 5th twist of this story is this. The casualty rate for portable flamethrower operators on Iwo Jima reached 92%. Of every 100 men who picked up an M2 backpack and walked it forward into Japanese fire, only 8 came home. It was the most dangerous job statistically of any combat assignment in the entire Pacific Theater. Woody Williams was one of the 8. He was wounded by shrapnel on March 6th and removed from the fighting, but he stayed on the island until the battle ended. On October 5th, 1945, in a ceremony at the White House, President Harry Truman placed the Medal of Honor around his neck. He went home. He worked for the Veterans Administration for 33 years. He raised 2 daughters. He outlived almost everyone he had served with. And on June 29, 2022, at the age of 98, in a VA hospital in Huntington, West Virginia, that had been named after him, Hershel Woody Williams died, the last living recipient of a Medal of Honor from the Second World War. He said something near the end of his life that bears repeating, because it is the kind of honesty that men who carry those weapons sometimes find when they are old enough. "I had a tremendous amount of difficulty," he said, "because I couldn't forgive myself for having to take so many lives in such a horrible, horrible way." That was Woody Williams. He carried that for 77 years. The flame tanks kept burning forward. By the second week of the battle, something happened on Iwo Jima that had never happened before in the history of the United States Marine Corps. Marine infantry battalions began holding up their assaults, pausing the advance, refusing to move, until a flame tank could be brought forward. This was not laziness, it was not cowardice. The Marines had calculated, in the brutal arithmetic of close combat, that the casualty difference between attacking with a flame tank in support and attacking without one was so large that it was worth the delay. Waiting 4 hours for a CBH-1 to be refueled and brought up to the line meant losing 30 men instead of 300. The CB report on the operation contains a sentence that captured this. The Marines would hold up the assault to wait for one of their Seabee-built flame-throwing tanks. The sixth twist is here. In the entire previous history of the Marine Corps, no infantry assault had ever been voluntarily delayed to wait for a single specific type of weapon system. The Marines did not stop attacking because they were tired. They did not stop attacking because they were frightened. They stopped because they had learned that this particular machine, built by two Navy mechanics in a workshop in Hawaii, was the difference between a company that took its objective and a company that ceased to exist. That dependency was unprecedented. It would shape Marine Corps combined arms doctrine for the next 40 years, all the way through Korea and Vietnam. And on the Japanese side, something was happening that had also never happened before. Captured documents and prisoner interrogations from the second and third weeks of the battle began to record a phenomenon that General Kuribayashi, the man who had refused to permit banzai charges precisely because they wasted lives, did not know how to stop. Japanese soldiers were beginning to leave their positions, not in large numbers at first, not openly, but here and there, in pillboxes where the flame tanks had been seen approaching. The defenders simply went back into the tunnel network and did not come out. They abandoned the orders to die at their posts. They could not face the fire. Post-war interrogations of captured Japanese soldiers told the same story again and again. The napalm came like a flood, pouring into every space. Men tried to escape through emergency exits and found more flames waiting. Some shot themselves rather than burn. Some ran into American gunfire because bullets were faster than fire. Veterans who had fought in China since the 1930s refused to enter positions once flame tanks had been spotted in the sector. This was not the death they had trained for. The fuel kept burning. By the end of the battle, 226,000 gallons of flamethrower fuel had been manufactured at the Schofield Barracks chemical warfare depot. Some days, the 5th Marine Tank Battalion alone consumed between 5,000 and 10,000 gallons. EM2C Joseph Kissel himself, the man who had wired the original tanks in Hawaii, traveled to Iwo Jima to provide technical field support, sleeping in the volcanic ash, working on damaged hydraulic systems by lamplight, while the 8 tanks they had built rolled forward and burned through everything in their path. Behind those tanks, the Marine infantry took casualties that would have horrified any previous American army. The 4th and 5th Marine Divisions lost up to 70% of their infantry strength before the battle was over. Whole companies were erased, whole platoons, but the advance, slow and bloody and inch by inch, did not stop. And underground, in the command bunker beneath the northern plateau, a 53-year-old general who had once driven across the wheat fields of Kansas was writing his last letters home and watching the only weapon he had not planned for burn his men out of the rocks, one cave at a time. By the middle of March, the men inside the tunnels were starving. The water rations had been cut to a cup a day. The rice was gone. The wounded lay in the underground hospitals with no morphine, no bandages worth the name, listening to the muffled drumbeat of American artillery overhead. The temperature inside the lower galleries rose past 120 degrees Fahrenheit because the sulfur vents in the rock pumped volcanic heat into the air the men were trying to breathe. A captured survivor would later write that the men he saw weighed no more than 30 kilos, that they did not look human anymore, that these emaciated soldiers, looking like they had come from Mars, still faced the enemy with a force that could not be believed. On the surface, the 8 CB-1 tanks kept moving. By March 17th, Lieutenant General Tadamichi Kuribayashi understood that the battle was over. That night, in his command bunker beneath the northern plateau, he composed a final message to Imperial headquarters in Tokyo. He wrote 3 traditional death poems in the waka form, the same form his samurai ancestors had used 6 generations before. The historian Kumiko Kakehashi would later read those poems as a subtle protest, a quiet rebuke aimed at the military command that had sent his men to die on this island without water and without hope. The same day in Tokyo, the Imperial headquarters promoted him to full general, He never knew. He sat in the dim light of the bunker and he wrote a letter to his wife Yoshi. He had been writing her letters for the entire 8 months he had been on the island. Letters about the cities he had visited in America years before, about the weather, about the small things a man tells his wife when he knows he will not be coming home. This letter was shorter. It said only what needed to be said, that this must be the destiny their family was meant to face, that she should accept it, that she should stand tall with the children at her side, that he would be with her always. She would receive it. She would be 40 years old when she became a widow. She had never worked outside the home in her life. She would have to learn how. 4 days later, on March 21st, the 6 flame tanks, still operational, were concentrated for a full coordinated assault on what the Marines were calling the Bloody Gorge, a twisted maze of ravines and caves at the northern end of the island, where the last 3,000 Japanese defenders had gathered to make their final stand. The tanks went forward in a crescent formation, throwing overlapping streams of fire into cave entrances that infantry could not approach. The Marines followed 50 yards behind, marking targets with white phosphorus grenades. The engineers came after, sealing the smoking cave mouths with demolition charges. In a single day, the Bloody Gorge consumed 8,000 gallons of napalm-thickened fuel. 800 Japanese defenders died. The Marines lost 92 killed and 257 wounded, a heavy price, but a fraction of what an unsupported infantry assault on the same ground would have cost. That night, 2 days before he sent his last radio message, Kuribayashi sat in the bunker and listened to the sound of the American advance overhead. On the evening of March 23rd, he sent the words that Major Yoshitaka Hori, 150 miles away on Chichijima, would remember for the rest of his life. All officers and men of Chichijima, goodbye from Iwo. Then he put down the microphone. He gave his last orders. And sometime in the hours that followed, sometime on the night of March 25th or the early morning of March 26th, he led roughly 300 of his surviving men out of the tunnels for one last attack. Here is the 7th twist of this story. The general who had refused to allow a single banzai charge in 36 days of battle, the man who had broken with centuries of samurai tradition specifically because he considered such charges a waste of lives, led the final attack himself. It was not, in the strict sense, a banzai charge. It was a coordinated 3-pronged night assault aimed at sleeping Marines and Army Air Force ground crews near the captured airfields. It was tactical, it was disciplined, it was, in some readings, an attempt to inflict one final cost on the enemy before the end. But it was also a man going forward to die on his feet, leading his men, abandoning the underground strategy that had been his life's last work, because there was nothing left to defend. The brilliant mind that had read American engineering journals at Harvard, that had driven across the wheat fields of Kansas in 1929, that had built the most sophisticated defensive position in the Pacific War, walked out into the dark with the few hundred men he had left. He never came back. The 8th twist is this. Lieutenant General Holland Smith, the Marine commander, who had once called him for smart bastard on the night of the first landings, ordered a full day's search of the battlefield after the fighting ended. He wanted to find Kuribayashi's body. He wanted to give the man a proper burial, with full military honors according to his rank, in recognition of what one professional soldier owed another. The Marines searched. They turned over the dead. They examined every officer's uniform they found. They never identified him. Years after the war, Kuribayashi's son Taro traveled to Japan and interviewed survivors of the garrison who had been captured. He pieced together what had probably happened. His father, Taro, came to believe, had been killed by American artillery during the final assault. 2 of his soldiers had carried his body away with them, as Kuribayashi himself had once instructed them to, and they had buried him beneath a tree near the beach at a small place called Chidori Village, before they too were killed. His grave was never found. His remains were never recovered. The most formidable enemy commander in the entire Pacific War, in the assessment of the man who fought him, simply disappeared into the volcanic earth of the island he had defended. On March 26, 1945, the United States declared Iwo Jima secure. The battle had lasted 36 days. The Marines had projected 5. American casualties were approximately 26,040. About 6,821 killed, the rest wounded. Of the original Japanese garrison of roughly 21,000, only 216 had been captured during the fighting. The rest, almost without exception, were dead. It was the only major battle in the Pacific Campaign in which American casualties exceeded Japanese casualties. The 4th Marine Tank Battalion, in its official after-action report, wrote the sentence that would echo through every subsequent history of the operation. The flamethrower was probably the most valuable single weapon employed at Iwo Jima, in a war that had produced the B-29, the proximity fuse, radar fire control, the carrier task force, and within months would produce the atomic bomb. The most valuable weapon at Iwo Jima had been built by hand, in a workshop behind a chain-link fence at Schofield Barracks by 2 enlisted Seabees whose names almost nobody remembers. The Army learned the lesson immediately. For the Okinawa invasion in April, the entire 713th Tank Battalion was converted to flamethrowers at Schofield Barracks under Colonel Unmacht's supervision. They burned through 200,000 gallons of fuel on Okinawa alone. In June of 1945, when production of the standard M4 Sherman was being wound down, the War Department gave Unmacht's flame tank program a AAA procurement priority, the same priority class as the B-29 Superfortress and the Manhattan Project. By VJ Day, 354 flame tanks had been built. Reiche and Kissel went back to civilian life. They received no medals, no public ceremonies. Their names appeared in one Naval Institute article in 1948, and then almost nowhere else for the rest of the 20th century. And on Iwo Jima itself, the silence settled back over the volcanic rock. But not completely. Here is the 9th and final twist of this story. The battle had been declared over on March 26, 1945. The American flag flew over the captured airfields. The B-29s began making emergency landings on the island within days. By the end of the war, thousands of American aircrew would owe their lives to the runways the Marines had bought with so much blood. But 2 Japanese soldiers were still alive in the caves. Their names were Yamakage Kufuku and Matsudo Linsoki. They lived underground. They moved at night. They scavenged American food from supply dumps. They did not know that Kuribayashi was dead. They did not know that Tokyo had surrendered. They did not know that the war had ended in August of 1945. They simply held their positions, as their general had ordered them to. They came out on January 6, 1949, 3 years and 9 months after Iwo Jima had been declared secure. Almost 4 years after Tadamichi Kuribayashi had walked into the dark. The fire on that island did not really go out in March of 1945. It just kept burning underground, in the memory of 2 men who did not know they could stop. Woody Williams lived to be 98 years old. He spent 33 years working at the Veterans Administration. He started a foundation to honor Gold Star families, the families of American servicemen who never came home. He spoke to school children. He spoke to Marines in training at Paris Island. He wore the Medal of Honor in public because General Alexander Vandergrift, the Marine Commandant, who had himself received the Medal of Honor at Guadalcanal, had told him in October of 1945 that the medal did not belong to him. In 1945, that the medal did not belong to him. It belonged to the 2 riflemen who had died covering him on Iwo Jima and to all the others who had not come back. He never forgot what he had done with that flamethrower. He never tried to. Near the end of his life, asked about it once again, he gave the answer of a man who had carried weight as honestly as a human being can. I had a tremendous amount of difficulty because I couldn't forgive myself for having to take so many lives in such a horrible, horrible way. That is the truest sentence anyone said about the flame weapons at Iwo Jima. The 8 tanks saved thousands of American lives. That is true. They incinerated thousands of Japanese soldiers, many of them trapped. many of them already starving, in the underground fortress they had been ordered to die in. That is also true. Both things are true at the same time, and any honest account of this battle has to hold them both. Lieutenant General Holland Smith wrote in his memoirs, years after the war, the sentence that should probably end this story. Of all our adversaries in the Pacific, Kuribayashi was the most redoubtable. He meant it as a compliment from one professional soldier to another, and he meant it as recognition that the Japanese general who built the fortress beneath the volcano, the man who had once eaten dinner with American families in Buffalo, New York, and driven a car across the United States in 1929, had fought the best defensive battle that an enemy commander fought against the Marines in the entire Pacific War. The volcanic island where it happened is called Iwo today. The Japanese government renamed it in 2007. Nature has reclaimed most of the battlefield. The tunnel entrances have collapsed. The sand has filled the trenches. Cherry trees grow on slopes where men once burned. Beneath the surface, sealed in caves that nobody will ever open, the bones of more than 20,000 Japanese soldiers wait out the rest of time. Most of them will never be found. Their general is one of them.